The fluorescent lights hummed their endless mechanical song as Hannah Clarke moved through the corridors of Mercy General with the practiced invisibility of someone who had learned that being forgotten was the only way to survive. 7 years. That's how long she had walked these halls in faded scrubs, her name tag reading nothing but H. de Clarke, RN, no credentials visible, no photographs on her locker, no personal details offered to anyone who might ask. The antiseptic smell, that sharp chemical bite of bleach and something older, something underneath, triggered the same muscle memory it always did, the field hospital in Sangin, the screaming, the blood that wouldn't wash away no matter how hard she scrubbed. She pressed her palms flat against the medication cart and counted her breaths. For in, hold for 4, out for 4. Tactical breathing. Combat breathing. The kind of breathing you learned when panic could get you killed. Her hands moved with unconscious precision as she checked for lines on the 3rd floor, the needle insertions clean, the flow rates adjusted with surgical exactness. The other nurses never noticed. They saw a quiet woman in her mid-40s, unremarkable, competent, someone who didn't attend the after-work drinks and never mentioned a family or a life outside these walls. What they didn't see was the way her eyes catalogued every exit the moment she entered a room, the tactical awareness that made her position herself so her back was never to a door, the way she moved like someone who had spent 18 years learning that vulnerability could be fatal. Her fingers found the unit patch inside her jacket lining, worn thin from years of being touched like a rosary, and she let it steady her. The weight of it was almost gone now, the thread barely holding the edges together, but it was still there. Proof that she had existed. Proof that it wasn't all a lie. She had been Senior Chief Petty Officer Hannah Clarke once, before everything changed. Before the operation in Sangin that officially never happened, before she witnessed what the Pentagon called regrettable contractor conduct, before the classified briefing where she was told that she had seen things that powerful people wanted buried. The Pentagon officer, a captain from NCIS with eyes like cold steel, had handed her discharge papers and said the word she would never forget, "You're a ghost now, Senior Chief. Act like one." Her son was already dead by then. Killed in action, Helmand Province, same mountain range as Sangin, 3 months before she even knew what had happened to his unit. She found out during that same briefing. The connection between the two was not coincidence. The captain made that very clear. The medication cart's cold steel pressed against her palms each morning as she pushed it down the corridor, the familiar weight reminding her that she was still real, still here, still breathing, still capable of doing something good in the world even if the world would never know her name. That was enough. It had to be enough. The admission paperwork came through at 0730 on a Tuesday morning, just as Hannah was restocking the supply cart in the main nurse's station. She saw the name first. Colonel Marcus Webb, blind, admitted through emergency department, admitted to 3rd floor, admitted to her unit, admitted to her rotation. Her hands froze over the clipboard. The plastic suddenly felt too thin, too fragile, like it might shatter if she squeezed it any harder. Marcus Webb. She would have recognized that name anywhere. He had commanded her son's unit. Charlie Platoon, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, a dark horse. He had been there at the landing zone when the IED went off. He had been the one holding her son as he bled out, the one who stayed with him until the medevac arrived, the one whose letter she had read so many times the paper wore through at the folds. The letter was locked in a safe deposit box at Chase Bank on Burnside Street, the only physical proof that her son had mattered to someone in command, that his death meant something beyond a line in a casualty report. She set the clipboard down and walked to the supply closet, closing the door behind her. The shelves rose around her in neat rows, bandages, gauze, alcohol wipes, nitrile gloves in their color-coded boxes. She pressed her palms against her eyes and let one breath escape. Just one. That was all she allowed herself. The supply closet was the only place where her hands ever trembled, where the composure she wore like armor could crack for exactly 30 seconds, and then she would reseal herself and walk back out into the world as if nothing had changed. When she emerged, her scrubs were straight, her hair was pulled back, and her face was neutral as water. She picked up the admission paperwork again and read the details. Cardiac condition requiring monitoring. Blind from IED blast. Multiple surgeries at Walter Reed, transferred to Portland for extended care and rehabilitation. No family listed. No next of kin. Just an old soldier with no one left who claimed him. The thing about Marcus Webb was that he had saved her son. Not saved him in the way that mattered, not in the way that would bring him home alive, but saved him in the only way left, by bearing witness. By being there. By not leaving him alone on a mountainside in Helmand Province while the dust settled around the wreckage of what had been a routine patrol. That meant something. That meant everything. Hannah pulled up the colonel's chart on the computer terminal, her fingers moving across the keyboard with practiced efficiency. Blood type O negative, same as hers. 3 Purple Hearts listed in his medical history, though the current system didn't show why or when. Previous surgeries: left below knee amputation, bilateral hand reconstruction, corneal replacement, both eyes, both failed. The man had lost his sight twice. Once to the IED. Once to time and medical limitation. And he had somehow kept living anyway. That one's going to be trouble. She didn't jump. The voice came from Dr. Hargrove, who had appeared in the doorway of the nurse's station with the kind of entrance that suggested he expected everyone to notice. His white coat was pressed with military precision, though he had never served a day in his life, and his Harvard ring caught the light like he was deliberately making sure you saw it. He was looking at the admission paperwork in her hand, specifically at the name Colonel Marcus Webb, and his expression suggested he had already calculated exactly how to weaponize this situation. Dr. Hargrove was the kind of man who understood power the way other people understood breathing. 58 years old, divorced twice, with a reputation for brilliant diagnosis and calculated cruelty. He had trained at Johns Hopkins and Mayo before coming to Mercy General, where he had built a quiet empire of allied physicians and board members who owed him favors. The other nurses whispered about his temper in the break room, the interns learned to avoid eye contact, and the residents understood that if he decided you were incompetent, your career trajectory would change course like a ship hitting a reef. Demanding patient. Hannah kept her voice neutral, her eyes still on the screen. This was the choreography she had perfected over 7 years: never volunteer information, never volunteer interest, never volunteer anything that might suggest you were anything more than exactly what you appeared to be. Blind Green Beret. Probably thinks he's going to command a hospital floor the way he commanded soldiers. Hargrove moved closer, and she could smell his aftershave, expensive, the kind that costs more than her monthly car payment. I'm thinking he'll be your primary assignment. You seem like the patient type. The kind who doesn't mind being ordered around. There was the hook. The bait. She recognized it because she had spent 18 years learning how to read the intention behind language. This wasn't an assignment. This was a test. Hargrove was watching to see if something in her would break, if the mention of a green beret would trigger some reaction, some crack in her armor that he could exploit later. He didn't know who she was. He couldn't know. But he was already searching for leverage, the way apex predators search for weakness in a herd. Hannah turned from the computer and met his eyes for exactly 2 seconds, long enough to be respectful, short enough to avoid confrontation. I'll take good care of him, Doctor. See that you do. Hargrove's smile was the kind of smile wolves use before they attack. Actually, I'm going to make a little wager with the staff. I'm betting you quit within a week. Being around that kind of trauma every day, the service, the PTSD, it tends to rattle people. Especially people who aren't used to it. He looked at her the way someone might look at a horse they were about to ride until it broke. What do you say, Hannah? Care to take the bet? She didn't respond immediately. She was aware of the other nurses watching now, aware of the silence that had settled over the station like a held breath, aware of the ticking clock that had just started in her chest. This was stage 1. Social attack. Public mockery. The kind of thing that was designed to humiliate and isolate simultaneously. It was practiced. It was calculated. And it was, if you didn't know how to read it, absolutely devastating to someone who cared what people thought. Hannah had stopped caring what people thought the moment she became a ghost. I'll be here next week, Doctor, she said quietly. And the week after that. Hargrove's expression shifted, not by much, just a slight tightening around his eyes, the look of someone who has thrown a punch and been surprised to find the target still standing. He had expected either agreement or visible distress. What he got instead was absolute certainty. The kind of certainty that comes from someone who has already survived the worst the world has to offer and walked out the other side still breathing. He turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing down the corridor, and Hannah returned to the admission paperwork. Colonel Marcus Webb would arrive on her unit sometime before noon. She would check his vitals. She would monitor his medications. She would do her job with the same precision she had done it every single day for 7 years. And she would not think about Sangin. She would not think about her son's final moments. She would not think about the unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining, or why it still mattered so much to touch it when the world was trying to pretend she had never existed. But the clock inside her chest kept ticking anyway. The next voice she heard was the admitting desk calling up from the emergency department. The colonel was on his way to the 3rd floor. ETA 5 minutes. And as the fluorescent lights hummed their endless mechanical song above her head, Hannah Clarke pulled up the patient care protocols one more time and waited for the elevator doors to open. The red marker hit the whiteboard with a sharp squeak that made Hannah's jaw tighten. Dr. Hargrove stood at the central nurses' station during morning rounds, his tailored coat perfectly pressed, his voice carrying across the entire floor with the precision of someone who had spent years making sure everyone heard him. The other nurses pretended to focus on their screens, but Hannah felt 20 pairs of eyes flick toward her, then away just as quickly. "I'm making a formal prediction, documented right here in front of all of you," Hargrove said, circling something on the board twice. "Our new assignment with Colonel Webb won't last the week. Some people simply don't have the constitution for difficult patients." He wrote her name with such deliberate slowness it felt like a death sentence. "Clarke, 7 days maximum." The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, indifferent witnesses to the public execution of her credibility. Hannah took one measured breath, feeling heat rise to her cheeks, but her face remained neutral, her hand steady on the chart she was holding. She didn't look at him. That was the first rule she'd learned in Sangin: never give them the satisfaction of seeing you flinch. 2 days later, the cafeteria smelled of overcooked chicken and industrial bleach. Hannah carried her lunch tray past the doctor's table, keeping her eyes on the path ahead. She'd learned to move like a ghost through these spaces, present but unnoticed, a skill that had kept her alive in places where visibility meant vulnerability. The other nurses sat in clumps, whispering about the new trauma surgeon, about weekend plans, about anything but the growing tension on the 4th floor. Then Dr. Hargrove stood. The chair scraped against the tile floor loud enough to silence nearby conversations, that metal-on-tile shriek that made everyone look up. He turned with theatrical surprise, his elbow connecting with her tray in one fluid motion that was too perfect to be accidental. The bowl of soup flew. Her sandwich tumbled. Her juice box burst across the tile in a spray of cranberry that looked like blood under the harsh cafeteria lights. 50 staff members froze mid-bite, forks suspended, watching. "Oh, sweetheart, you really should watch where you're going," Hargrove said, his voice dripping with false concern. "Though I suppose clumsiness runs deeper than just walking, doesn't it?" Someone laughed. A nurse Hannah had trained. The sound cut deeper than any insult. Hannah stood in the puddle of soup, her scrubs darkening at the knees. One tear escaped down her cheek, not from shame, but from the sheer effort of standing still while her hands wanted to move, to fight, to remind this man what a body trained for combat could do. She wiped the tear away without breaking eye contact with Hargrove, her gaze steady as a sniper's sight picture. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. "A man who needs to prove his power this badly has already lost it," she said quietly, her voice dropping an octave lower than it had been weeks ago. The cafeteria held its breath. Hargrove's smile faltered, just for a second, before returning harder, meaner, like a predator sensing something dangerous in its prey. Hannah knelt to pick up the tray herself, her movements deliberate and controlled, gathering each piece of debris with the same precision she would use to pack a medical evacuation kit. No one helped her. No one moved. When she stood again, her scrubs were soaked, Her hair had come loose from its ponytail, and she looked like someone who had already lost everything and therefore had nothing left to fear. She walked to the trash bin, deposited the debris, and returned to the floor without looking back. But her hand found the inside of her jacket, that small place where the faded unit patch was sewn into the lining, a tiny piece of task force dagger, a reminder of who she really was beneath these scrubs, beneath the carefully constructed invisibility. Her fingers traced the embroidered edges, and she allowed herself exactly 5 seconds of breathing that wasn't controlled. The next morning at the nurse's station, Hargrove was waiting. He had Hannah's patient chart spread in front of him, his fingers drumming against the desk in a rhythm that sounded like anticipation. The station occupied the center of the 4th floor, surrounded by open space, giving his next move an audience. He waited until Hannah approached before sweeping all the papers off the desk with one arm, a gesture so casual it would have looked accidental to anyone who hadn't been trained to see premeditated violence disguised as spontaneity. Charts scattered across the floor like snow, landing under desks, sliding beneath the medication cart, floating down the hallway in a slow-motion cascade. "Pick that up, sweetheart," he said, leaning against the counter with arms crossed. "And when you're done, I want a full review of every medication decision you made yesterday. Due by end of shift." He watched her kneel to gather the papers, and his smile was the smile of someone enjoying his own power, feeding on the humiliation like it was oxygen. Hannah collected each page with steady hands, her movements economical and precise. She'd sorted medical records in blackout conditions by touch alone. Scattered charts were nothing. She stacked them carefully, organized them by patient room number, and stood. Her scrubs had been changed since the cafeteria, but there was still a faint smell of soup on her skin, that sour vinegar smell that wouldn't wash out until she got home. She met his eyes, direct, unflinching, the gaze of someone who had looked at the worst things the world had to offer and refused to blink. "I'll have that review ready, doctor," she said, her voice level. "Will yours include the 3 protocol violations I documented from your rounds yesterday, or should I submit those separately?" The room went so quiet you could hear the ventilator wheeze from the patient rooms down the hall. Hargrove's smirk faltered, his jaw tightening, and for one beautiful moment Hannah saw him calculate the odds, understand that she had been watching him with the same intensity he had been watching her. The smirk returned harder, meaner, but it was different now. It was the smile of someone realizing he'd made a mistake by thinking she was prey instead of a predator in camouflage. He stepped closer, his voice dropping. "You think you're clever? That's going to make this more fun." Then he walked away, his phone already in his hand, his fingers moving across the screen with purpose. Hannah watched him disappear into his office, and something in her chest went very still, the way it went still before a mission, before the helicopter doors opened and reality changed forever. The next day, Colonel Webb was admitted to her station. She recognized him immediately from his file, Marcus Webb, former company commander, Green Beret, the man who had held her son's hand as shrapnel tore through a convoy in Sangin. Her hand shook only once, in the supply closet, for 12 seconds. Then she straightened her spine, pulled the unit patch deeper inside her jacket where no one could see it, and walked back into the hallway. Colonel Webb was blind. An IED had taken his sight during a patrol in Helmand Province 3 years after her son had died, but his other senses were still sharp, still trained, and when she entered his room his head turned toward her voice before she'd even spoken. "You," he said. "I know you. I know your voice." Hannah moved with practiced professionalism, her voice now flattened to something almost mechanical. "Just a nurse, Colonel. I'm going to check your vitals." But he wasn't confused, and she knew it. He was quiet for the rest of the day, his blind eyes moving beneath closed lids like he was trying to see into memory itself. 2 days later, everything changed. Hannah was checking his vitals during what should have been a routine morning examination when his blood pressure began dropping precipitously, the numbers on the monitor plummeting like a descending aircraft with engine failure. His blind eyes moved rapidly beneath closed lids as he gasped for air, his hand reaching out to find something to hold onto. She called for the crash cart while her hands moved to his chest, feeling for the telltale signs, muffled heart sounds, distended jugular veins, the sensation of fluid pressing down on his heart like a fist closing. Cardiac tamponade. Compression. Death in slow motion unless she moved now. Dr. Hargrove arrived and froze in the doorway, his face going pale as he stared at the monitor's plummeting numbers, his mouth opening and closing without sound like a fish suffocating in air. But Hannah was already moving. Her combat training overrode every hospital protocol as she grabbed the pericardiocentesis kit, her voice calm and clinical as she explained each step to the nurses around her, needle going in now between the ribs, fifth intercostal space, just below the xiphoid, drawing back steady, inserting the needle with absolute precision, the kind of precision that comes from having done this before when the alternative was watching someone die. Dark blood filled the syringe as she drew back the plunger, and Webb's pressure stabilized almost immediately, the numbers climbing from dangerous red back toward livable ranges. You can't, that's not within your scope, Hargrove stammered from the doorway, but Hannah was already documenting the procedure, her hands rock steady now, the trembling gone completely, replaced by something else entirely. The thing that happened when you'd been trained to keep people alive in conditions that would make most people's brains simply shut down. Colonel Webb reached out blindly and caught her wrist, his grip strong despite his weakened state, his face contorted with something between pain and recognition. That voice. I know that voice. Clarke. Hannah Clarke. You were there, weren't you? In Sangin. You were with my unit. Hannah's face went white, and she gently extracted her wrist, whispering, "You're confused, Colonel. The medication, the sedation makes people dream sometimes," before stepping back as other nurses rushed in to help, her hand still trembling now, not from effort but from the impossible weight of cover story colliding with truth. From the doorway, Dr. Hargrove's expression shifted from shock to something calculated, dangerous, something that looked like opportunity. He pulled out his phone and stepped into the hallway, and Hannah heard him say 3 words before she turned away, "We need lawyers." Colonel Webb's blind eyes moved in distress, searching for a face that wasn't there. His body went rigid on the examination table, chest heaving like something was closing in from the inside. Hannah was checking his vitals when his blood pressure dropped like a stone, 140, now 98, now 76. The monitor screamed its alarm. His pulse thready. Gasping. The space between his ribs was filling with fluid that shouldn't be there, and his heart was drowning. Cardiac tamponade. She knew the look before the diagnosis was spoken aloud. Dr. Hargrove stood frozen in the doorway, his phone still in his hand from wherever he'd been making calls. His jaw moved but no words came out. The color drained from his face like someone had opened a valve. Hannah was already moving, muscle memory overriding protocol. She didn't ask permission. She didn't check the chain of command. She reached for the crash cart and her hands moved with the kind of certainty that made people instinctively obey. "I need a 14-gauge angiocath. EKG monitor here. Now." A resident fumbled for the needle. Hannah took it from his shaking hands and positioned herself at the 5th intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. Colonel Webb's breathing came in short, panicked rasps. She could feel the desperation in his lungs, the same frequency of terror she'd heard in field hospitals when men knew they were dying and couldn't stop it. "You're going to feel pressure," she said to him, her voice steady as a surgeon's laser. Then relief. The needle went in. She threaded the plastic catheter through, past the pericardium. The hiss of air escaping as fluid drained into the collection chamber, dark red, urgent, the sound of time running out. 30 milliliters. 50. 90. His oxygen saturation climbed immediately, 82, now 88, now 94. His blood pressure responded like a plant receiving water. 104 systolic. Improving. Stable. 2 minutes. That was all it took to pull a blind green beret back from the edge. Colonel Webb gasped and his hand found hers on the bedside rail. His fingers gripped with a strength that surprised her, and he said nothing, but his grip said everything. She squeezed once. Released. Never made eye contact, not because she was afraid of being recognized, but because in this moment, she was just the hands that saved him, and that was enough. Dr. Hargrove still hadn't moved. His phone was lowered now, and his expression had shifted from shock to something darker. Something calculating. He stepped into the room with the slow precision of a man who had just realized a problem had become something else entirely. A liability. A witness. Proof of something he couldn't yet articulate but could feel in the room like static electricity before lightning. "Good work, Clarke," he said flatly. His voice had no warmth in it. "Just assessment. Get him stabilized. I'm calling cardiology for a full consult," and he stopped. His jaw clenched. "Actually, I'll oversee his care directly from this point forward. You're reassigned." Before Hannah could respond, the emergency department radio crackled to life. Not the normal page. The urgent tone. The kind that made everyone's spine straighten because it meant the ER was about to become a war zone. "All units, this is dispatch. Mass casualty event, I-5 northbound near the Morrison Bridge. Highway pile-up, multiple vehicles involved. Initial report is 8 to 12 victims, unknown number with critical injuries. ETA first ambulance, 7 minutes. All available personnel report to the emergency department immediately. Code red is active." The radio went silent, but the silence was alive with electricity. Hannah heard the shift immediately, the gathering of energy on the floor above, the shuffle of people moving fast, the metallic rattle of equipment being pulled from storage. The intercom crackled again. "All hands to trauma, all available staff report immediately." It was Dr. Morrison from the ER, his voice sharp with the kind of urgency that didn't tolerate delays. Hannah's feet were already moving toward the door. She had done this before, not in a Portland hospital, but in a forward surgical base outside Sangin with ordnance landing close enough that dust fell from the ceiling. She knew exactly what mass casualty meant. She knew what the next hour would demand. Dr. Hargrove stepped directly into her path, his arm raised like a barrier. "Not you, Clarke. You're assigned to the colonel. Stay on this floor. That's an order." She opened her mouth. He was already walking away, his phone returning to his ear, his voice dropping into that tone he used when he was calling in favors. She caught fragments, "need to document everything," and her scope of practice is limited, and "call legal." He was already building a case while a man was dying in a bay 3 floors below. Hannah looked at Colonel Webb. Stable. Sedated now, his chest rising and falling with the rhythm of someone at rest. His blind eyes moved beneath closed lids like he was dreaming of something safer than reality. The faded unit patch that had held 18 years of secrets pressed against her ribs under her jacket, stitched inside the lining where only she could feel it. Where only she could know that she'd been decorated for exactly this kind of decision, choosing the mission over the order, the dying over the comfortable hierarchy. The intercom crackled again, more insistent, "Trauma team to Bay 3, patient coding, compressions in progress." She returned to Colonel Webb's room and stood there for exactly 15 seconds, listening to the chaos being built 3 floors below. She could hear it in the voices, in the rhythm of activity that was too fast, too desperate, the sound of people drowning in work they weren't equipped to handle. The numbers came to her through the intercom system like a play-by-play of failure, compression rate too slow and oxygen sat 64, dropping, and "we need more hands, where is everyone?" Hannah walked deliberately to the stairwell door and descended in silence, her footsteps echoing off concrete and fluorescent hum. The emergency department doors opened and she entered the controlled chaos like stepping into a current that had been waiting to sweep her away. The trauma bay was a masterpiece of organized panic. Young couple in Bay 1, the man's left leg crushed between vehicles, the woman bleeding from a head wound. Teenager in Bay 4 in respiratory distress, ribs moving in patterns that meant pneumothorax. Elderly woman with internal bleeding that no one seemed to be monitoring properly. The resident in Bay 3 was doing compressions on a patient whose color had already changed, and his technique was wrong, too shallow, panic-driven. Hannah didn't announce herself. She didn't ask permission. She took over Bay 2 where the young man's leg was being managed wrong, and her hands moved with the kind of authority that didn't require a title. She called for blood products with a voice that sounded like it had commanded soldiers, because it had. She identified the tension pneumothorax in bay 4 that the resident had missed, ordered a needle decompression at the second intercostal space, and her calm was so absolute that a panicked nurse stopped shaking just from being near it. The second line went in. Her voice dropped to a register that made people obey. 14 gauge, mid-clavicular, right now. The needle penetrated. The hiss of air escaping into the collection chamber. O2 saturation climbed in real time. 68 to 76 to 84 to 92. Another life pulled from the edge. Another win against the void. 3 bays. 40 minutes. 3 people who would have died under the current pace of care. She moved between them like someone who had done this under mortar fire, because she had. Pain was information. Death was just data. The body was a machine with specific mechanical failures, and she knew how to fix them. When she finally looked up, Dr. Hargrove stood at the edge of the trauma bay, his phone in his hand, his face cold and perfectly composed. She recognized that expression. She'd worn it herself during briefings where bad news had to be delivered without emotion. But his composure was predatory. He was already thinking 3 moves ahead. That's practicing outside your scope, insubordination, and abandoning your assigned patient, he said quietly, his voice loud enough that the whole department heard it. Security. Escort Nurse Clarke to HR. Now. But that wasn't the worst part. The intercom crackled. Code blue, Trauma Bay 4. All hands. Hannah's feet moved before her brain caught up, muscle memory pulling her toward the stairs even as the rational part of her mind screamed that she wasn't supposed to be there, that Dr. Hargrove had ordered her to stay on the 4th floor, that leaving Colonel Webb unattended was exactly the violation he was waiting for. But a mass casualty event from a highway pileup had just hit the ER, 7 incoming, 3 critical, and the part of her that had performed 18 combat evacuations under fire in Sangin province didn't care about hospital hierarchy. It cared about lives. The stairwell door swung open and she descended for flights in seconds, her scrubs whipping around her as she moved with the terrifying fluid precision of someone who'd already survived the worst this world could offer. The emergency department was chaos, organized chaos, but chaos. 2 trauma bays were occupied, a 3rd patient was still in triage, and the attending physician was standing motionless over a patient with a crush injury to the lower extremity, blood pooling on the trauma bay floor in a pattern that told Hannah everything: vascular compromise, compartment syndrome developing, amputation risk escalating by the second. She didn't announce herself. She didn't ask permission. She moved to the medication cart, drew up a 1 milligram bolus of epinephrine, and was already assessing the second critical patient, a young woman with a pneumothorax so severe her oxygen saturation was dropping like a stone, 78% now, and the resident was reaching for a chest tube tray with the hesitation of someone who'd never done one under real pressure. Hannah was already there, her hand steady as a surgical laser as she found the second intercostal space mid-clavicular line, prepped the skin, and inserted the needle decompression. The hiss of air escaping the pleural space was like a pressure valve releasing, and the young woman gasped, color returning to her face as oxygen saturation climbed. 88%. 92%. The resident stared at Hannah like she'd just materialized from another dimension. There wasn't time for explanations. The 3rd patient, a man in his 60s with a penetrating abdominal wound, was pale as bone marrow and his blood pressure was 68/42, which meant internal bleeding somewhere in his abdomen and maybe 40 minutes before cardiac arrest if they didn't move fast. Hannah was already running toward him, her voice cutting through the controlled panic like a command, not a request. Get me a level 1 rapid infuser, push 2 liters normal saline wide open, I need a surgical consult now. And someone call up for an operating room. The trauma surgeon who'd been coordinating from the corner turned toward her voice, and his expression shifted from confusion to something that looked like recognition. Something that looked like relief. What happened in the next 37 minutes was muscle memory operating on autopilot. Hannah coordinated the care of 3 critical patients while the regular trauma team moved back into supporting roles, watching her work with the kind of focused intensity that only came from having done it hundreds of times before. She called out vital signs, made adjustment calls, anticipated complications before they happened, her voice dropping an octave with each decision until she wasn't asking anymore, she was ordering. The woman with the pneumothorax was stable, breathing on her own, 96% oxygen saturation. The man with the crush injury had his bleeding controlled and was headed to surgery with a viable limb. The abdominal wound patient was prepped for emergency laparotomy, his blood pressure stabilized at 94/58, still critical but no longer exsanguinating. As the trauma surgeon escorted the last patient toward the OR, he paused beside Hannah and said quietly, "Thank you." "Not thank you, nurse." "Not thank you, can you hand me something?" "Just thank you." Like he was thanking someone who'd just pulled him back from the edge of a cliff. Hannah nodded once and turned to clean her hands, the raw power of those few minutes already beginning to settle back down into the careful invisibility she'd maintained for 8 years. But that wasn't the worst part. Dr. Hargrove appeared in the ER doorway 30 seconds after the last patient left, his face the color of old brick, and Hannah felt the weight of what she'd just done descend on her like artillery fire. She'd violated a direct order. She'd performed procedures that technically required a physician's supervision. She'd exposed herself in front of dozens of witnesses, and more than that, she'd outshone him so completely that every person in that emergency department now knew exactly who the better doctor was, and it wasn't the man with the title. His jaw clenched. His hands balled into fists. He turned and walked back out through the automatic doors without saying a word, but his silence was louder than any shouting. That's when Hannah knew. Within 48 hours, Dr. Hargrove had activated his entire network like a man calling in every favor he'd ever earned. He called board members who donated to his research fund, contacted the VA hospital where Hannah had worked under her cover identity to dig through her personnel file, and brought in outside investigators from a private firm to scrutinize every chart she'd ever signed, building a case that made her look not heroic but reckless, dangerous, someone who thought she was smarter than the actual physicians, someone who'd put patients at risk through her arrogance. The documentation he assembled was meticulous. 17 chart discrepancies that he claimed showed poor judgment. 3 instances where she'd allegedly acted without proper authorization. The pericardiocentesis she'd performed on Colonel Webb, which he now characterized in writing as unauthorized intervention in a patient outside her scope of care. The timing was calculated, the presentation was professional, and the conclusion was predetermined. On the second afternoon, Hannah was called to a small windowless office on the administrative floor where the HR director sat with a stack of papers already arranged on the desk, Dr. Hargrove standing against the far wall with his arms crossed like a man who'd already won. "You performed procedures reserved for physicians," the HR director said, not looking at Hannah, reading from the prepared statement. "You defied a direct order from your supervising doctor. You left your assigned patient unattended during a critical period. Do you dispute any of these facts?" Hannah sat with her hands folded in her lap, the faded unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining pressing against her ribs like a heartbeat, and shook her head. What could she say? That she'd been trained to make those calls at a level that made every resident in this hospital look like a first-year student. That she'd held more critical patients than any physician at Mercy General would see in 3 decades of practice? That the muscle memory of saving lives in Sangin province was too deep to be overridden by something as fragile as a hospital job, a cover identity, a lie that she'd gotten too comfortable living? The HR director slid papers across the desk. "We're terminating your employment effective immediately. Security will escort you out." Within 2 hours, the same security guard who'd smiled at Hannah every morning for the past 6 months now stood beside her locker with apologetic eyes, watching as she packed the cardboard box with the minimal evidence of her existence at Mercy General. Extra scrubs. A packet of protein bars she kept for double shifts. A photo of her son in his lieutenant's uniform, face down so no one would ask questions about who he was. The guard, his name was Marcus, though she'd never asked, shifted his weight from foot to foot. "I'm sorry," he said. "I know you saved lives." Hannah didn't respond. She simply closed her locker, picked up the cardboard box, and walked toward the hospital exit. Through the glass doors, she saw Colonel Webb being wheeled back from A. Procedure, his blind face turning toward her as he recognized her footsteps. Hannah Clarke, he said, and something in her chest cracked. I'm remembering now. Your son. James. He was in my unit in Sangin. But his nurse was already pushing him toward the elevator, and Hannah was walking out the automatic doors into the Portland rain, officially erased from one more place, one more life, one more institution that had briefly needed what she could do before deciding they'd rather preserve their hierarchy than acknowledge the truth. She couldn't defend herself. She couldn't say that she'd been ordered to vanish after Operation Lighthouse went sideways, after her team witnessed contractor atrocities that powerful people wanted buried, that her name had been scrubbed from every military database, that surfacing would mean consequences she couldn't predict for herself or for her son. So she walked into the rain with a cardboard box containing the last 6 months of a lie, and she disappeared again, just like she'd been trained to do. The rotor wash hit the parking lot like a monsoon. The Black Hawk descended through the Portland drizzle, its rotors spinning down as dust kicked across the asphalt in concentric circles. 2 Navy SEALs in full dress uniform stepped out of the side bay, their dress white so crisp they looked pressed that morning, boots hitting the wet pavement in perfect synchronization. They didn't run. SEALs never ran in public. They moved with the terrifying fluid precision of men who'd spent their careers walking toward gunfire. The automatic doors to Mercy General's main entrance slid open before they reached them. The front desk staff went completely still. Senior Chief Clarke, the team leader, said, "Not a question." It wasn't a request. It was a command spoken quietly enough that only those standing within 3 feet could hear it. His voice carried the weight of operations that would never be declassified, of decisions made in darkness at 3 a.m. when the world was sleeping. "We need to collect her. Medical clearance for transport." Hannah was in a VA hospital waiting room 2 blocks away, staring at chipped linoleum tiles that had been repaired so many times they looked like a mosaic of institutional failure. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was steady. Her entire body had learned to be a locked door years ago. She held a copy of the Portland Gazette folded to the employment section, though she hadn't turned the page in 20 minutes. The headline above the fold read, "Decorated Navy Nurse Fired Days Before Military Exoneration, Mercy General Faces Investigation." Her hands didn't shake as she read it. Her jaw didn't clench. This was the part no one prepared you for, the freedom after the firing, the strange hollow space where a lie had been living. The waiting room door swung open and a runner, a kid no older than 22, lean and hard in navy dress whites, stopped directly in front of her. "We need you." They found the files. All of them. Hannah didn't move. She'd learned that movement could give away more than stillness. She'd learned that letting people come to you was a power they never expected. What files? Operation Lighthouse. Sangin. The contractor evidence. The Pentagon unsealed everything 4 hours ago. Congressional testimony, combat footage, medical records, all of it. The runner's voice cracked slightly. Young. This kid was young enough that he probably hadn't learned how to swallow emotion yet. "Your son is at the hospital. He's asking for you." She stood once. No rushing. No gasping. No hands pressed to her face. The lieutenant inside her stood up first, then the nurse, then finally the mother who'd spent 8 years pretending her son wasn't a ghost in scraps of classified paper. The lobby of Mercy General looked different when you weren't trying to disappear in it. The fluorescent lights no longer felt like surveillance. The polished floor reflected her uniform, the dress whites that had been sealed in a plastic bag in the bottom of her closet for 8 years, with a clarity that felt like permission to exist. Her son stood 3 feet from the main entrance, and when he saw her, his face cracked the way young officers' faces crack when the weight of command finally catches up with them. He was in his navy dress blues, his lieutenant insignia sharp against the darkness of his jacket, and he was crying without bothering to hide it. "Mom." The word came out like a question. Like he was asking the universe if this was real. Hannah crossed the lobby in 17 steps. The count came automatically. 17 steps. The distance of a secure perimeter. The distance of safety. When she reached him, she didn't embrace him. She handed him the declassified file instead, watching his hands, her hands, the same size, the same shape, open the pages that had been sealed since before he was born. His eyes moved across the first paragraph. They widened. They filled with something between rage and relief, between validation and grief that had nowhere else to go. They found it, he whispered. They found the evidence. The black sites. The contractor records. He couldn't finish. Young officers couldn't finish sentences when the things they'd suspected but couldn't speak about were suddenly printed in official Pentagon letterhead. The SEAL team leader stepped forward, his presence moving the air itself. This was a man who'd spent a decade making decisions that changed the course of wars, and now he was about to make a decision that would change the course of careers. His voice, when he spoke, carried to every corner of the lobby, to the nurses at the station, to the orderlies restocking trauma kits, to the visitors sitting in the waiting area with their small anxieties about surgeries and biopsies that suddenly felt very small. Senior Chief Petty Officer Hannah Clarke. 2 silver stars. Navy Cross. 18 confirmed lives saved under direct enemy fire in Sangin, Helmand Province, before you were ordered into witness protection after reporting war crimes by private military contractor forces. He paused. The silence was so thick you could operate in it. Your testimony is now declassified. Your service is now declassified. Your name is declassified. You're not invisible anymore. Dr. Hargrove stood near the emergency room entrance, pale and motionless, watching the dissolution of every advantage he'd ever built. His face had the look of a man watching his institutional power evaporate in real time. The hospital administrator stood beside him, and beside her was the HR director who'd handed Hannah the termination papers with apologies that neither of them had believed. The security guard, the same man who'd handed Hannah a cardboard box with apologetic eyes 7 days earlier, walked directly to Dr. Hargrove. He held an identical cardboard box. The guard's voice was flat, professional, the tone of someone who'd done this job long enough to understand that power consumed itself. "I believe you know the way out, sir." The words landed like a bullet. Dr. Hargrove opened his mouth. Closed it. His hand came up and came back down. The Harvard ring caught the light once more before he turned and walked toward the exit, the security guard following 3 paces behind, the cardboard box held at his side. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The only sound was his footsteps on the tile floor, echoing down the corridor like a countdown to a conclusion. 6 months later, Hannah stood in her dress whites at the Pentagon. Not in the lobby. In the main auditorium. 300 people filled the seats, Navy personnel, SEAL Team 3 Charlie platoon in dress uniform, congressional staffers, the Secretary of Defense, and her son in the front row with his uniform pressed so sharp it looked dangerous. The Secretary of Defense smiled, an actual smile, not the political performance smile, and stepped forward with a Navy Cross on a blue ribbon. The commendation included details that had been buried for 8 years, her name, her rank, her call sign, every operation, every life saved, every decision that had cost her the right to exist anywhere. The ribbon went around her neck. The weight of it felt like permission. That afternoon, a former colleague from Mercy General named Patricia sent her a message, "Thought you'd want to see this." The photograph showed a man sitting behind a folding table in a strip mall parking lot, his white coat replaced with a polo shirt embroidered with an insurance company logo. The Harvard ring was gone. The silver pen that had belonged to his father was gone. The institutional power that had allowed him to humiliate nurses in cafeterias and bury complaints in filing systems was gone. Dr. Hargrove was selling life insurance policies from a folding table under a faded banner that read Metro Valley Coverage Solutions. The Portland Medical Board had revoked his license pending investigation. No hospital in the state would hire him. The outside investigators he'd brought to scrutinize Hannah's charts had instead scrutinized the protocol violations, the buried complaints, the pattern of targeting nurses who questioned his authority. His network had evaporated the moment he became a liability rather than an asset. The board members who'd taken his calls days earlier had sent his calls to voicemail. The medical director who'd been his mentor had released a statement condemning his apparent lack of judgment. Hannah kept the photograph for exactly 1 day. Not because she forgave him, but because he simply didn't matter anymore in the life she was rebuilding. She returned to Mercy General not as an employee, but as a consultant training the trauma staff in combat triage protocols. She walked through the same corridors where she'd once made herself invisible, now meeting every gaze directly. The emergency department hung a plaque beneath a spotlight near the trauma bay. It read, "In recognition of the 3 lives saved in the highway pile-up incident, July 14, Senior Chief Petty Officer Hannah Clarke, United States Navy." Not all heroes wear capes, some wear scrubs. Colonel Marcus Webb visited monthly for his follow-up appointments. His vision had partially returned through surgery. The blind green beret could now see shapes, light, the outline of the woman who'd saved him. They sat together in the exam room talking about Sangin and her son and the operations that had finally been unsealed, 2 people who'd been erased by the same system now reclaiming their stories in the light. Hannah Clarke wasn't invisible anymore. She didn't need to be. If you believe in accountability and the protection of military whistleblowers, subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with your thoughts. Share this story with someone who needs to know that speaking the truth, even when it costs everything, eventually sets you free. The heroes among us walk these halls every day. Sometimes they're in dress whites. Sometimes they're selling insurance policies in strip malls, facing the consequences of their choices. Justice isn't always loud. Sometimes it's just a woman in her dress uniform, finally allowed to exist in the light.